started, but he says that his dream will never die. He is hoping to be among a wave of Scottish nationalist MPs sweeping into Westminster after the general election, there to continue the campaign for independence by other means. And Alexander's with me now. Good morning to you. Good morning to you. In the book you've just published, you say right at the end that everyone deserves a second chance, and so do countries. There is a strong hint there that another chance is coming soon.
Yeah, every person and every nation is what I say. Yeah, I mean, I think quite clearly, as you said in your introduction, the story's not finished. The circumstances when that will become about, I think that's quite difficult to put a time scale on, but I think the direction is now as near inevitable as anything can be in politics.
You say in the book that if the Scots vote again for a party at the Scottish elections who want independence, that could be the moment when it's put to the touch, I think is your phrase.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happened is we've now established the gold standard of how you have a process for Scotland to become independent. What has to happen is party or parties have to put it in a manifesto for the Scottish election. They have to win a majority in that proportional parliament to hold a referendum, and then the decision, of course, lies with the Scottish people. So, in a way, it's the people who determine the time.
It's fairly clear. It's not this general election that's going to change things dramatically, though it may change things for Westminster. But that will not, of itself, produce another referendum. But the SNP could put a referendum promise into the manifesto for Holyrood next year, and that would then be the trigger.
Well, you're quite right. Independence will not be decided at this coming general election. This election will decide whether Scotland makes progress, whether progressive politics across these islands make progress with SNP victories. As for what's in the manifesto next year, well, that's I can look you straight in the eye and say that's a matter for my successor, Nicola Sturgeon.
And you'll have nothing to do with it, I'm absolutely sure, Alexander. Now, you were talking about the outcome of the general election, and you've talked in the past about a progressive coalition, not just of the SNP, but Plaid Cymru and the Greens as a new force in Westminster politics. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think Nicola Sturgeon's outlined this very well. I mean, her joint press conferences with the Greens in England and Plaid Cymru for Wales, of course, are allies there with Natalie Bennett and Leanne Wood. And setting out a joint approach to progressive politics. What does progressive politics mean? Well, it means moving away from austerity. It means not spending £100 billion in the next generation of nuclear weapons in the River Clyde. It means having a different approach to politics and economics than the conventional parties at Westminster.
So you say a different approach, you say moving away from austerity. Do you think the deficit, that great big lump of debt, sitting in the middle of British public life, is a problem or not?
Well, of course it's a problem. The question is, how do you deal with it? Do you deal with it sensibly, or do you do slash and burn, like the Conservatives and the Labour Party have signed up to? It's interesting when Nicola Sturgeon outlined a 0.5% real-term increase in departmental budgets over the next financial term. It was the National Institute for Economic and Social Research who described that platform as fiscally sustainable. Even the Financial Times last week actually suggested a move away from austerity. You know, we've come to a pretty pass when the Financial Times is more left-wing than the Labour opposition.
Well, I want to just sort of drill down what that means. So you're against big public spending cuts under all circumstances as a way of dealing with the deficit.
But we're saying that there's the freedom for manoeuvre of having a 0.5% real-term increase in departmental public spending over the next fiscal term. That will allow both the debt as a percentage of the overall gross domestic product and indeed the budget deficit to come down to a sustainable level. But it will avoid swinging cuts to public sector budgets, and of course a re-emphasis of the situation we've had over the last 5 years, where the poorest 10% of the population have borne the brunt of the Chancellor's austerity.
But you can't deal with the deficit by spending more unless you raise revenue more, which means raising taxes more. So what I'm asking you is whether you think that the deficit should be mainly dealt with by tax raising on people who can afford it.
No, the deficit's dealt with by extending the period of fiscal consolidation. And that's what
it goes on for longer. You keep
it
for longer.
But the deficit's still falling as a percentage of GDP, and indeed the stock of debt is falling. And that's perfectly sustainable. That will give you, by the end of the term, a 2% budget deficit. I mean, the average for the UK over the last 60 years is about 3.4%. So it's a perfectly sustainable position.
You can extend it without raising taxes and without the public spending cuts the main parties are committed themselves
Correct.
to.
Now, that's the proposal to be put forward. That's the one that the National Institute described as fiscally sustainable.
And this is the kind of thing that you'll be taking along to Ed Balls and the Labour leadership when you talk about any possible post-election deal.
That's right.
Now, who does that? Is that you or is that Nicola Sturgeon or both?
Well, Nicola Sturgeon's leader of the party. I mean, she's in charge of.
But you'll be leader of the Westminster MPs.
No, Angus Robertson's leader of the group at Westminster. But I mean, the SNP has a very collective approach to these things. But I mean, the person who calls the ultimate shots is Nicola Sturgeon.
So when you talk to the Labour Party, you will be saying we want a different economic strategy from you, and we want much tougher commitments on Scottish Home Rule.
Yes, we want the delivery, Andrew, of what was promised, the pledge, the vow that was made to Scotland in the desperate days when the three Westminster leaders, the suspended Prime Minister's questions, rushed up to Scotland because they thought they were losing the vote, and they said, Home Rule, devo to the max, near federalism is what the language was. We want the delivery of what Scotland was promised. We want the manifestation this year of what was promised last year.
From your book, it's clear you just don't trust the Treasury. You think if there isn't a new deal, the Treasury will simply draw back all the commitments that have been made so far.
I think we're in an extraordinary situation. Mr. Nicholas McPherson, the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, is about to, I suspect, come in for trenchant criticism from the House of Commons' own committees in terms of the famous letter he said published ruling out a currency union between an independent Scotland and Westminster. I mean, unprecedented behaviour. I think when you have somebody who's prepared to enter the political arena as a civil servant in that fashion, then you're in a situation where not only a long-standing mistrust of the Westminster Treasury, but a mistrust of the personnel who are involved is very evident. Hence,
it's very important. Personal, all of this, isn't it?
Well, very important to have that block of that tartan block occupying the green benches of the House of Commons.
Coming back to the possible trigger for either a new referendum or some other way of Scotland and the rest of the UK separating politically, we have, of course, the possibility, we had Nigel Farage in, of an in-out referendum on the EU, possibly this year, possibly next year. Now, if that happened, and England voted to leave the EU, but Scotland voted to stay in, would, in your view, that be the trigger for separation?
Well, we're going to be against having that referendum, and I think Nicola Sturgeon outlined a very ingenious mechanism that you can avoid this happening, and that is to accept there should be a triple lock, that each of the component, and remember what David Cameron said, an equal partnership of nations within these islands would have to vote by majority to leave the EU for it to take effect. So that's if there were to be a referendum, which we oppose,
but
then that's the proposal.
If there is a referendum, it'll be the Conservatives in the UK calling the shots.
If you pardon me, that I think if you look, and I mean I take nothing for granted, but I think if we take a glance at any poll, then I think the Scottish National Party will be calling substantially more shots than UKIP in the next parliament.
Okay, well, in those circumstances, let's talk about how the SNP could work with Labour or not work with Labour. Ed Balls is clearly very against doing a deal with you, partly because of what you said on his economic plan, I guess. It has been suggested...
That's his fault for having a Tory economic plan, not my fault.
No, it's not. I wasn't saying it was your fault, but what I was saying is that it's perfectly possible, and this was suggested in a columnist in Scotland a little while ago, that the Labour Party could just tell you where to go, could treat you very roughly, because the SNP could not put the Tories into power, and therefore Labour could simply say, well, do your worst. We dare you to vote us down. However many MPs you've got, we dare you to vote us down. We will do what we want. We want to keep Trident. We want to keep our £30 billion austerity plan, and so forth. Do your worst.
I can see that as a great rallying call to Labour supporters across the country, saying we want to spend £100 billion on nuclear weapons and go ahead with Tory austerity cuts. I can see mass revolution breaking out in constituency Labour parties that are
for these islands.
Well, can I just think, but Nicola Sturgeon's outlined this very well. We won't do a deal with the Tories, informal, formal, under any circumstances. But other options are available. The Labour Party have ruled out a coalition, but haven't ruled out a confidence and supply arrangement where you have a set programme for a set number of key votes.
That's what you think will happen?
Well, I think it's more likely to have a vote-by-vote arrangement. Now, I've got some form in this. I mean, I led a minority government for 4 years. In fact, I'm the only person, as far as I know, in these islands who's done that. So I had to deal with the Labour Party, for example, in the Scottish Parliament to get support to abolish prescription charges. I had to deal with the Liberal Democrats to get support to abolish tuition fees on students in Scotland. I had to get support from the Conservatives to do something about the burden of business rates. And I got quite progressive support from the Greens on a range of issues. So I was in the position where I had to negotiate on a vote-by-vote basis. As they would. Because, Andrew, if you hold the balance, then you hold the power.
So you hold the power. So the big issue is, for instance, the budget. So Ed Balls' budget would have to be negotiated with the SNP if a Labour government was going to sustain itself.
Yes, I mean, any minority government has to negotiate in order to win a majority for its proposal. That's patently obvious, and to deny that is to deny reality. When I faced that reality in the Scottish Parliament, I couldn't say, well, I wish it was different. You had to get down and do your best for the people under these circumstances. And if the SNP are in these circumstances, it'll be very good for Scotland, certainly, but I think for progressive politics across these islands.
Okay, but if I'm Ed Balls, and I say, no, I
wouldn't wish that on you.
Nonetheless, indulge me for a second. I'm Ed Balls, I've got my budget. I say, no, I'm going to stick by it. Alex Salmond, you and your SNP MPs are not going to vote down my budget. You're not going to go into the divisional office with the Conservatives under any circumstances. I am safe to do what I want.
Right, okay, so I propose an amendment to your budget. Let's say, for example, I say, look, instead of this very, very slow, fast rail coming up from London, I think we should start it from Edinburgh, Glasgow to Newcastle, and I put that down as a budget amendment. It would have substantial support in the north of England from the other parties and will carry the House of Commons. What does Mr Balls do then?
Well, it'll be very interesting to see, because, I mean, what a lot of people are worried about is a period where every single vote in the House of Commons is unpredictable, is debated, is mattered, and you get the impression, at least, of a relatively weak government.
Well, I did 4 years as a minority government, and at the end of 4 years, the people of Scotland decided to give the SNP an overall majority, but that does indicate there was a pretty substantial satisfaction with the 4 years of minority government. You know, this is commonplace elsewhere in the world. I mean, there's a great mistake in believing that Westminster is the norm. Okay, it's not. Westminster is abnormal.
I'm no longer Ed Balls. I'm now a swithering Middle English voter watching this discussion and saying, are there any circumstances in which the SNP are going to raise taxes on me?
Well, there's the top rate tax. I mean, we've voted against its reduction in the House of Commons, and we would do that again, because we think as long as we have a situation of great pressure on families, then you should look after the poorest sections of society, not after the richest sections of society. That's a belief we have. But listen, many people in England have that belief as well.
New taxes, extra taxes.
No, we don't have any proposals.
So the SNP won't come down and tax me as my swithering English voter.
No, we set out the anti-austerity plan that Nicola Sturgeon put forward to extend the period of fiscal consolidation to allow real spending increases as opposed to swinging cuts. That seems to me a sensible proposal.
So vote SNP or vote Labour, and you'll get a left-of-centre government compared to the current Labour leadership.
Well, I think hopefully that decisive bloc of SNP MPs will move the Labour Party in a different direction, and I think many people south of the border would like to see that as well.
Are you concerned by some kind of south of the border backlash about people who say, why should the Scots with their own parliament now be telling us what to do in this way?
Well, I tell you what, I think there's lots of people, certainly lots of people in Scotland, with SNP membership that just reached 100,000 in Scotland this weekend. But I think people across these islands are pretty fed up with the duopoly at Westminster, and I think they might like to see politics a bit more interesting, where parties have to work for their votes, and you have to justify things on a vote-by-vote basis to the people of the country. I think lots of people will find that a much more exciting and productive system of politics.
Now, you yourself are not perhaps the most popular politician amongst the Westminster group. Paddy Ashdown gave a withering review of your new book.
Very rude.
Very rude indeed. He said it was the longest... I don't think I can say what he said.
No, you can't say it. Can I just apologise on Lord Ashdown's behalf for the bad language of the Liberal Democrats?
That's very touching. But were you stung by some of the reviews of that book?
No, I was commenting that there was, and this is actually arithmetically correct, there was more people at my book signing in Union Street in Aberdeen than there was at the entire Liberal Democrat conference. Not the highest standard, you might argue, but nonetheless true.
All right, for now, Alex Hammond, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now to Sian for the news headlines.
Thank you. The Conservative Party have suspended